So tonight we have only two melachot, but there are quite a few details. It took me a little while to put them together. These melachot, we don't come across them too often, not because they don't exist, not because they don't occur, simply because people are ignorant. So these two melachot are very important to pay close attention, because they do happen. They can happen on any Shabbat, just we need to be aware of them. These are two particular ones that people are just unaware, and they're one of the melachot, the 39 melachot which are prohibited on Shabbat. The first one is meraked. Meraked in English means sifting. As you know, we've discussed various melachot that are similar in their function, and that is, they involve removing the psolet, the unwanted food, that which is not desirable, from that which is desirable. One was called borer, one was called dash or zoreh, and one is meraked. Dash is a little bit different. Dash was threshing. You were not necessarily removing anything, you were breaking up the wheat in its original form in the stalk. You were breaking up the kernels from the chaff, from the straw, but you were not necessarily removing one from the other. Whereas in zoreh, which was winnowing, one used the wind to blow away that which one does not want, and that allowed the kernels to fall to the ground. In borer, one was using his hands to remove any pebbles or any other psolet that which he does not want from the food. And the same is with meraked, which is called sifting. What is the difference between sifting, winnowing, and borer, which means sorting or choosing from a mixture? So some say the basic difference involves the tool or the method. One involves the hand, one involves using the wind, as in winnowing, and one involves a sieve. It's a special keli that is used particularly for a similar function, and that is to remove that which we do not want from that which we want. So even though they are similar in function, they use different methods, or they occur at different stages. One occurs at the stage of flour. In preparing the flour, we want to make sure that it's completely clean. One occurs at the time when the kernels are being separated from the rest through the wind. They occur at different stages. Regardless, all three are of course prohibited, and there are quite a few details that we need to know, especially how they apply in the kitchen, what is permissible and what is not permissible. So the most common, perhaps, type of meraked that you will come across is through a form of filtering or straining. Now the sieve itself, what distinguishes a sieve from a strainer, usually, it's not necessarily always, but usually is as follows. In a strainer, what are you letting out? You're letting out through big holes liquid, and you are retaining that which you want. So you're straining that which you do not want and retaining in the smaller holes, or actually not in the smaller holes, but the more solid food in the strainer. Typical example would be noodles, I guess, right? Things like that, where the liquid is straining out. That is the form of meraked too, even though it could be also borer. Depending on how you do it, it could be either borer or meraked. And strainer might be called more meraked. With a sieve, borer. With a sieve, what it usually happens is the opposite, is that what you do not want, you are retaining. And that which you do want, you are letting through small holes. So the bigger psolet is staying behind, and the finer food item, doesn't have to be food as we will see, you're letting through. That's called a sieve. Okay? That's the tevulah, the function of meraked. One is now out of sift, which is the like borer on Shabbat, using the sieve, or anything that resembles a sieve, just like a strainer or a filter. But we will see that there are situations where filtering is permissible. Right? We'll talk about that soon. But this is just for you to understand what we're dealing with, is that this system of filtering, straining, sifting is very similar to borer and it's a sur. One of the main differences here between meraked and perhaps other items is that meraked does not, for example, tohem. Actually, I think that it would apply to quite a few of the melachot. Meraked also applies to gidulei karka and non-gidulei karka, whether it grows on the ground or does not grow. Whether it's food or not food. For example, let's say you have some pearls or some diamonds that got mixed into sand. And now you want to take this just like a gold miner, right? And you want to sift it through to find, that would also be a sur on Shabbat. So it does not have to be food. The tevulah, the function of meraked, is a sur for food items and non-food items as well. Also in meraked, you do not have the advantage of miyad like we had in borer. Because some of these melachot are very similar, but some do not have the same exemption. So, for example, the exemption of miyad that we had in tochen, if you're grinding, that some opinion hold if you're going to eat it right away, or with borer. Remember, with borer you're allowed to take the food that you want to eat and that which you do not want to eat, as long as you eat it immediately. In tochen, and especially in borer, miyad is an advantage. You're going to be eating it right away, so as long as you take that which is allowed. You can't take out the celery from the tuna if you don't like celery. But you can take the tuna from the celery, that which you are going to eat, as long as you do it immediately, as long as you don't use a special keli, a special tool for it. But with meraked, you don't have the advantage of that, miyad. Even miyad would be prohibited. What's the difference between meraked and tochen or borer? In meraked, you're performing a sifting prior to eating. You're not going to eat it right away. It's one of the processes, one of the stages of the preparation of the food. So it's not edible yet. You're not going to eat it yet. It's not ready yet. Whereas with borer or tochen, you're about to eat it. That is the last step. That is why miyad helps in borer and does not help in meraked. Okay, just a few concepts that we need to be familiar with, which will help us to figure out when we can and when we cannot do meraked, or when we can filter and when we can sift and so forth. Because even though sifting is asur, there are situations where it may resemble, but it's permissible. So the three important concepts to keep in mind are mayim achurim, achur tzad, and salul. Sometimes you have items, like liquids especially, which I translated with lots of impurities. This would be typical in Mexico, for example. If you live in Mexico, unless you got used to the tap water, I would not recommend you drinking the tap water, because you're going to get a stomachache. So what you want to do is filter that water from all these impurities, right? But the problem is, because people would not drink this water as it is, because it has lots of impurities, because they would not drink it as it is, it's asur to filter. So anybody that has a filtering system there, you would not be able to use it on Shabbat. If it's under this category of mayim achurim, which means it's a mixture, a liquid, let's say, some food item that is so full of impurities that you would not eat it as is unless you would remove the impurities. So regardless of how the impurities are removed, it would be asur. Follow? So we'll get to that. Yeah. But that's the first one. The one that is full of impurities that you would not ordinarily eat or drink the way it is unless you remove them. So any tool that you use to remove those impurities, whether it's a filter system, whether it's another form of sinun. Sinun just means another form of straining, would be prohibited. But then you have a situation where you have achur tzad. But before we get to achur tzad, let me give you some more examples, because we don't live in Mexico, we live in LA, and we want to know what would be considered mayim achurim, something that has a lot of impurities. It doesn't have to be water. It can be juice that's full of pits and peels and all sorts of impurities that you would not drink that way. Okay, orange juice with pulp, some opinions permit it. Why? Because that would be under the under the next category. A lot of people would drink it as it is anyway. So all you're doing is refining it or purifying it a little bit more. You're not really straining it. It's not called really meraked. So some say that pulp of juice is okay. The only person who's not allowed to strain the pulp of orange juice, for example, is he who is very, very picky. Since he is makpid and picky about the pulp, so to him, that would be called borer meraked. He would not be able to. But for most of us who don't mind, I actually like the pulp, right? So if you strain it out a little bit, some are of the opinion that it's permissible. You may not want to do it because you may get confused, where yes and where not. But just to give you an example, that will fall into the second category where certain things have some impurities, but impurities that people would let go, would not mind. And an example of that would be the tap water, perhaps in Los Angeles, or actually not Los Angeles, but anywhere where they have some impurities to the water, but people would drink it. Shum davalo, if nothing would happen if they drink it. It's some little impurity. You can barely see it, and it's okay. That is why we can even use the aerator. You know what's the aerator right underneath the faucet? It has a little small filter, and it helps a little bit in LA. You don't really need it, but it's better to have it, because sometimes there's a lot of minerals and little pebbles. But people could drink the water even without that. So that doesn't really contribute so much, and therefore you can have it. It's not a problem, even though it acts as a filter. It's a form of meraked, but in this case it's permissible because it doesn't contribute. It's clean as it is. That would be called salul. Salul meaning that it's completely clear, just about. But there's something called achur tzat, with a little impurity. So if it's with a few little impurities, it's not such a big problem. If it's completely clear, then for sure there's no problem. But even if it's a little bit unclear, it's okay. However, midrabanan, we do not allow this by rabbinic decree. Midoraita would not apply, but midrabanan, by rabbinic decree, it's prohibited. Anything which has some impurities, it would not be permissible to filter out. Perhaps if we gave examples, we would understand this a little bit better. What would be something that has a little bit of impurity? Let's say you drank tea with leaves, and it has a little bit of leaves, and not everybody would drink it like that. Some people would, perhaps. You would not be able to filter out or to remove the little bit of leaves in the tea, right? That would be considered a few impurities, a little bit of impurity. Or let's say coffee, Turkish coffee. Even though with Turkish coffee there's other problems. There's a problem of bichul in Shabbat. You cannot easily make Turkish coffee in Shabbat because it was never cooked, that coffee, as opposed to Indian coffee. Yes. Right. I'm going to get to that soon. Right. How do you do it? But just if you had a little bit of impurity, so at least with the Rabbanan it would be prohibited to remove those little impurities that are still there. Let's see, there's another example. Another example, I think, of impurities that I can think of is shmarim in wine. The sediment, that's what it's called in English, sediment. In wine, that it's very difficult to drink. You would not be able to strain all the sediments out. You could have a lot, you could have a little. Either way, both of these categories, it would be asur, prohibited on Shabbat, at least with Rabbanan, from removing it from the liquid that you're about to drink. Unless it's completely clear, and you want to use a little bit of a filter, to filter it a little bit more from microbes or whatever, that's fine. I guess if you're in a situation, there are opinions that if you're in a situation where you're in a country where you're not sure the water may have some impurities and you want to use a handkerchief to stop anything that might not be good, they permit it. We're only rely on that lenience if you have no other choice and you're unsure about the safety of the water. The handkerchief will not help you too much, depending on how bad the water is, but it may help from some impurities. So that may be permissible only b'sha'at at-hat, if you have in a place where you don't know what's in the water, what you're about to do. On top of whatever. What? No, not on top of the glass, the bottle, because that will be permissible. We'll see how that is performed. But to actually strain the water, to pour it over it, in that way. Because as we will soon see, I left it for later, how one can actually drink from a cup or a bottle. It's completely different. Here we're talking about the actual function of straining, whether you use a sieve, whether you use a mitzahat, in the case that I just gave you, or some other keli, that it would be prohibited if there are lots of impurities. But we will see that with the bottle, with the cup, it's completely different. Alright, I put down over here a colander or a strainer. Are you familiar with what that is? For spaghetti and for those things. These are additional kelim, whether you're putting tea leaves or you're putting spaghetti into these kelim. It would be, you would not be, if it's mixed with water, you would not be able to use that keli to sift it through. However, if you recall, when we spoke about cholent, when we spoke about transferring food from the pot to the plate with a ladle that has holes, right? That has holes, a slotted spoon called. It would be permissible to use it if your intention is just to transfer it over. But if you can't use that either to let the liquid out. So the same thing here, if you're transferring it over using that tree and some of it is dripping out, that's permissible. So you cannot use any of these. No, let's say you have the crock pot, okay? Here you took it out from its container, the metal container where it's cooking. You took it out, and now you want to transfer the contents into dishes, right? You're allowed to transfer it immediately, but you cannot hold it until the liquid drains out, right? You can transfer over because that would not be called a real meraked or real borer because all you're doing is transferring it over. And a little bit is falling, that's okay. Clean what? No, the floor is one next to the other. It doesn't even spill, right? You have the plate, you have the pot, and you just pour. You're not taking it across the kitchen. Okay, then we have something called confectioner's sugar. You know how there are some kelim, some vessels or whatever you want to call them, that you can use to spread the sugar, the powdered sugar, the confectioner's sugar. Even though what is happening resembles meraked, it's it's not called meraked. It's not called sifting. Why? Because you're not sifting anything. You're only spreading it thinly and evenly. That's all. That's permissible. If you want to serve something on Shabbat, you have a cake, you forgot to put a little bit of the sugar, the icing, that's permissible. You're not sifting, right? All you're doing is spreading it. That would be permissible. This one is tricky. Salt shaker. Why? Because even though a salt shaker is like sugar that you're spreading, right? The problem is some people put rice into the salt shaker. You know why they put rice? It should not clump up, right? So the problem is if you have rice, you're shaking it and the rice is left behind, it may be according to some, a form of meraked. So it's better to avoid that. It's better just to open up the salt shaker and you need a little bit of salt instead of pouring it. I saw that with somewhere, so I figured I'll share that with you. Because some are machmir in that. Some are strict with that. Okay, here comes the interesting one. Even though we talked about filtering, how it's prohibited, if we're dealing with a cup or a bottle that is covered with some form of filter, and as you're drinking, whatever is inside what you don't want is left behind, cannot pass through, that's permissible. Okay? As you are drinking, there's no problem of meraked. There's no real meraked. Because that is the derech ha'achila. Remember, it's like remember watermelon, taking out the seeds as you're putting it into your mouth? So if as you're drinking, something is staying behind that you don't want, that's okay, regardless of how it stays back. So as you're drinking, you know how you have sometimes for babies, for little kids, you have little cups that are narrow on top. Some of the solids perhaps stay behind. That's permissible. There's no problem with that. Whether it's in a bottle or in a cup, it's permissible as long as you're drinking at that time. That's the derech ha'achila. However, it's a little bit different when you're brewing tea. That's the example of a kumkum. A kumkum, a tea kettle. There are sometimes people who brew tea, and they use a kettle that has a little, like a reshet, like a little filter at the mouth of the tea kettle. So when you pour, it doesn't let the tea leave out. That's what we were talking about, right? So let me tell you how to do that. You can use it so long as when you are pouring, there are no leaves coming out. In other words, let's say you have a full tea kettle full of water, tea. The tea leaves are at the bottom. When you are pouring, the tea leaves are still at the bottom. So what that's holding it back is not really accomplishing it. It's just there in case a leaf would come out. So at the time the water that is sitting on top of the leaf is coming out of the tea kettle, it's permissible. However, once most of the water was poured and all you have is a little bit of water left with tea leaves that's mixed, then it would be prohibited. Then you would actually be causing a borer of sorts of the water that is mixed with the leaves. So if you had water that's mixed with leaves, the leaves is not at the bottom, you would have to wait until the leaves settle. Once the leaves settled, the water that's on top is not mixed. Remember we spoke about borer, anything that is not mixed, it's sitting on top, you can remove. For borer to be borer, it has to be a real mixture. So here there's no real mixture. At the time you are pouring, that strainer is not really straining anything, because if it would, then it would be another form of meraked. So you can use, it's only there because you don't want eventually to go through. But at the time where it's full of liquid and the tea leaves are at the bottom, none of the leaves are coming through. And only because of that, it's permissible at that time to pour. Even though it's pouring through the strainer, at that time, however, the strainer is not doing what it's meant to do. And that is why it's permissible. So you can brew your tea before Shabbat, of course. Use it on Shabbat, as long as there's, the leaves are at the bottom, and there's a lot of liquid on top. So at the time that you are pouring, the leaves are not coming close to the strainer. Then it will be okay. Okay, with large pieces, tafatim dolim, large objects, there's no meraked. So that's the example, for example, if you're removing eggs or potatoes, large objects from the pot, right, it would not be considered meraked. It's just like in borer. With borer, anything which is identifiable is not part of the mixture. So you can pick it out. It's not called you being borer. The same thing here with meraked. If you are removing large objects, like eggs from the chamin, Moroccans put eggs in the chamin, or your large potatoes, right? Even though a little bit of liquid drains from it, that's okay. That's not called meraked. You're not holding back anything from the solid here. And that which you do not want is a large object. Whereas meraked means to separate things which are very mixed together, one from the other, that I cannot easily do with my hands. This I can easily pluck it out with my hands. So by picking it up and a little bit of water being strained out through the holes would not be a problem. That's not called melech. Okay, this one is going to surprise you the most. Because with filtering, it resembles borer. We're somewhat familiar with it, seeing examples of it. It's just there are different methods in how to go about it. But you have to be aware of in Shabbat that you cannot strain or you cannot remove that which you do not want from that which you want, regardless of the method you use. However, this one is tricky. Lash. Lash means to knead. Remember we spoke about the various steps that were taken in the Mishkan to prepare food or to prepare. Lash means to knead. I'll give you when you make dough, you're kneading the dough. Water with flour. That's called lash. To knead. Lalush. So in the Mishkan, they did all these things in preparation of the lechem apanim, to bake the bread, or to prepare the dyes, the colors that were used in coloring the garment. So they would grind the herbs, they would knead, whether it was the dough or the herbs with liquid to make a paste. All of these melachot were used in the Mishkan. So kneading is the next process of whether it was to prepare the bread right before the baking, or whether it was to prepare the herbs before they were made into a paste. Okay, the various opinions hold that kneading applies whether it's a liquid to a solid or a liquid to a paste. Typical kneading means that you take liquid, typical, and you mix it with a solid. What's a solid? Flour. Now this flour, in its present state, is a bunch of particles, right? Of grain. What happens when you put the water into the solid? It turns into a dough, right? This is called lisha. There is a question of when the lisha occurs. Does the lisha occur as soon as you pour the water into the flour, or does lisha occur as soon as you start mixing or making a batter? Regardless, we follow the more stricted opinion that regardless what you do, whether you pour the liquid into the flour or whether you're mixing it only, the two of them are prohibited. Both of them are called lisha. And the same, according to some opinions, applies to even if you pour liquid into an already existing paste, but you are enhancing it more, that would also be called lisha. So lisha, as you will soon see, can be in quite a few ways mixing of liquids and solids, that by the combination of the two, you're forming a sort of paste, which will be prohibited on Shabbat. So this is an extremely important melacha to be familiar with, because many times we might prepare foods on Shabbat by mixing liquids with solids. Let me jump to an example. Here, down here. You have avocado that you mash before Shabbat. I say before Shabbat because some say that you're not allowed to do it on Shabbat unless you knew it. But it's called tochen, like grinding. You have mashed avocado that you want to add oil to it, or mayonnaise. So you're making a paste. You're making what they're doing perhaps can be melacha. So you have to be very careful. Yeah. So we're going to talk about all that. What you can do and how to do it. To be safe. Okay? Alright, so lisha involves mixing and kneading. Either of the two is prohibited, but the process involves the two of them. Before we go on, it's important to be familiar with a few concepts. There's something called bar gibul and something called lav bar gibul. There are some items, or some food items, that by their very nature, they dissolve and they fuse. They can easily combine. The best example that I can think of is potato flakes. You know the powdered potato flakes that you buy? As soon as you pour a little water on it, boom, it easily fuses and becomes mashed potatoes. You can't even recognize the original form anymore. It's completely fused, it's completely dissolved, it becomes a new entity. That will be a typical, classical example of lisha on Shabbat, even though it does not involve flour. See, the mistake most people might make is that when they hear kneading, they think of dough. They think of flour. You're not allowed to make flour on Shabbat. You're not allowed to knead the dough. You're not pour water on flour or put flour into the water, right? No, lisha also applies to other food items. Not only does it apply to other food items, it even applies to non-food items. Water in sand. Make mud, that will be a form of lisha. The children who are playing in the sandbox, remember we spoke about the sandbox? They can play in the sandbox, not muktzeh, but they should not pour any water into the sand. So that would be a form of lisha. So bar gibul is any item that would easily dissolve and fuse together, become a real pasty food. That's called bar gibul. There's no question about it that this is asumi doraita. You cannot make it on Shabbat. Anything which involves ingredients that are bar gibul, they easily fuse and dissolve and mix and become a very thick paste. Certain cereals, for example, too, like oatmeal, will be a problem. You cannot make that on Shabbat. Remember, there are other problems too. There could be problems of bishul if you're using hot water. So that's besides the point. We're not talking about cooking right now. That's another problem. But just the combination of liquid, certain foods may be lisha. Yes. Oh, good question. That's a good question. If you already have the oatmeal ready before Shabbat, and all you want to do is add a little bit more liquid, as long as that oatmeal already had some liquid before Shabbat, and it was already a little bit of a paste, then you're allowed to add a little bit more liquid. However, what you should do is anytime there's a question of whether something is lisha or not, that might be an issue, you should do it b'shinui. And there are two ways to do shinui. Shinui means in a changed way, with a change, in a different way. Shinui with lisha would be, if you're used to usually pouring the liquid into the solid, do the other way around. Pour the solid into the liquid. That's one shinui. The second shinui is in the way you mix it. Usually you use a spoon, use your finger. And if you have to use a spoon, then use the back of the spoon, and don't stir it too strong, just mix it slightly. Because when you tend to mix very, very strong, that is how you accomplish lisha sometimes. If all you're doing is doing a small mixture, then it would be as a problem. Especially if you had already had this mixture before Shabbat. If it was mixed before, all you're doing is adding a little bit of liquid, and you're going to mix it a little bit, it's permissible. Yeah, we're going to get to that. Coffee is over here. Yeah, we'll get into that. Right now we're talking about items or ingredients that are easily dissolved and mixed, and some that are not dissolved. Yeah, we have to be careful with both items, regardless. What? Dry cereal? What kind of dry cereal? Cornflakes is fine. Cornflakes is okay with milk. Yeah, because that is something which does not mix. We're not talking about before davening. We're talking about after davening, after kiddush. Obviously, if you can't have it before davening, that's a separate question. That's a question of eating before davening, before kiddush. But let's say somebody's sick, or for little children. Okay, so cereals like cornflakes, soggy. No, these things is no problem. You can have cornflakes with milk. That does not come under this category, or bar gibul or la bar gibul. It does not even form into a paste. It does not. It simply does not stick. It doesn't stick, and therefore it's perfectly fine. Yeah, like the oatmeal, the daisot, the coarse cereal, the kind that's made to cook or to mix with water, to make it a paste. What? Yeah, some people have it with milk. Yeah, you have all these different kinds of with packets. Yeah. Or with hot water, but then there's the problem with bishul, of cooking, you have to be careful with. Let me see if I wrote down here a few examples. What is that? What do you mean a timer? As long as you put it on before Shabbat. You cannot have something cooked for you on a timer. In other words, that it goes on at a certain time and starts cooking for you. That you can't have. Before Shabbat, you can begin to put something on a crock pot or on the stove that it will continuously cook into Shabbat. One of the only items that you can use on a timer are lights and air conditioning perhaps. Things of that nature, but not cooking, not that melachah cooking. And we even suggested that if you have automatic sprinklers, it's connected Friday afternoon, so you should not turn on Shabbat, because that's called zorea. If you're irrigating or watering your lawn, even though it's happening by itself by timer, you should not have it Shabbat. Nothing will happen if for one day the grass is not watered. Yeah, sure. So that's on the whole time. Okay, some items that are not lav bar gibul, that are listed or brought down, would be, for example, ashes, some of the more coarse cereal. It does not fuse well, but it does stick. And it would also not be permissible, according to most opinions, to put water on. Anyway, the following examples are a little bit more significant. We have blila avav, blila raka, and davar nozel. Something which is a thick paste, or a thin mixture, or something which is completely liquefied. That is what we really have to be concerned with. Because when we are mixing things, we need to be aware what kind of a mixture are we forming. Because even if you were to take a cereal, even if you were to take something that fuses, that becomes a paste, imagine if you pour a lot of liquid on it. Henna is an example. If you pour a lot of liquid, it becomes very liquidy. It does not become a paste anymore. That's mutar. That's called lilaraka or davar nozel. So if you're ever going to do that, you're going to pour a lot of liquid into something, you're not going to have that problem usually. The problem where you may have is when you are pouring a little bit of water into some sort of food that may create a paste. Now there are opinions that hold that if you have something chopped very, very thinly, even like egg salad, you cannot put oil on Shabbat or mayonnaise because you are forming a paste of sorts, even though it's not the same like a cereal, and even though there are some who hold that it's okay to do so with food that you're about to eat, because that's the derech, not the derech achilah, but that is a tikkun. It's called tikkun ochel. If you want to slice it up a little bit, we don't rely on that opinion. We're very careful, and somebody cannot do it before Shabbat, which would be the proper thing to do. What he should do is, with those items that are chopped very thinly, he should do it with a shinui. That's the best way to handle it. Right, egg salad with a shinui, tuna salad with a shinui, if possible. No, it's a shinui because you don't do it this way during the week. Shinui means that's different than what you would do it during the week. So one way around it is either to pour a lot of liquid, and you for sure don't have the problem, but you don't always want to pour a lot of liquid. So either you do it before Shabbat, or you do it with shinui. But this shinui business only applies to those items that are not bar gibur, right? You cannot do it with the shinui, for example, the example I gave before with oatmeal, or with the potato flakes. That's really meshes and becomes a real isa, like a real dough. That's real lisha. Real lisha in that sense does not allow for shinui. Shinui would only help in those cases where there are other leniencies. Yeah, I'm getting to that. That's next. Almost next. Okay, so that's lila ava. In making a thick paste, we run into trouble, regardless of what food item you're using. The example I gave before was with an avocado. It can become a very thick paste. So you either do it before Shabbat, or just eat the avocado perhaps without the oil or the mayonnaise. But that could be a question of whether that's called lisha or not. Right. Exactly. If it's just you cut it into pieces, but it's not mashed, then it's not a problem. Then it's okay. That's called katikot b'dolot. When you have big pieces like egg salad, actually not egg salad, potato salad, right? Coleslaw. When it's big pieces, it does not really become a paste. That would be permissible. So the problem is when you're making it very, very small, or when you're mashing it, then it becomes a blila ava, which is problematic. Okay, we had the next one was blila raka, which would be typical. I think the best example of blila raka is masame, or even a cake batter. A cake batter, is a little bit looser. It's not as thick as cookie dough, right? And anything which is a little bit looser is called blila raka. Matzah meal, for example, if you just wanted to use matzah meal with some liquid, that's not a very thick paste, and that would qualify with the shinui would even this. The other example we gave before, somebody asked me, was if it was already had a little bit of mixture, a little bit of liquid before Shabbat, it's okay to add. Here, even if it's without, but if all it is a blila raka, it's okay. Davar nozel is completely liquefied. There's no paste at all. Typical example is instant coffee. Cocoa. You have a mixture of things that you're pouring in, but there's no paste being formed, right? That's okay, there's no problem. No, that's okay. That's not a problem, because you're not doing it, right? You're basically just pouring the mixture together and drinking it the way it is, and whatever forms the bottom is not really lisha. Yeah, so that would be permissible. That's under davar nozel, which is completely liquefied. Just have to be careful from bishul, from cooking. Actually, another good example of something which is very liquefied is a mixture of mayonnaise and ketchup, right? They're liquids, they're not solids. There's no solids involved. That would also qualify as something which is liquid. That would be permissible. Before I forget, there are opinions that hold that you cannot make jelly on Shabbat. Not jelly, jello. You know how it forms, right? Because of the various issues that it resembles there too. Yeah. So on Shabbat you should not make that. Anything that coagulates and forms into a jello sort. Okay, the rest I think are just a few examples that you want to be aware of that will help us understand how lisha is not necessarily only with dough, but can apply to other things. Ashkenazim make rain. You know what rain is? The horseradish, the red horseradish with vinegar. Or on Pesach we all have charoset. Well, let's say you forgot to make the charoset before Pesach. And this year Pesach is the idea on Shabbat. Charoset is a very good example of something which is paste. It's going to be a thick paste, depending how you prepare it. So what do? You want to have charoset. You pour a lot of liquid. Or you can do it perhaps with the shinui, by not mixing it very well, by doing it the other way from what you would regularly do it. And same thing with grain, you would want to do with the shinui. And dips. Dips can be with baba ganoush or anything that you mix, whether it's with the oil or the mayonnaise or butter, to create a dip where people dip their foods. So this kind of a dip is also a form of the paste. It may be a blila raka, not a blila ava. It may not be a thick paste, it may be a thin paste, but it's still a form of paste, and you might need to do it at least with shinui, not your ordinary way that you would the rest of the week. These are all examples of things that approximate lisha, and there may be a problem on Shabbat depending on how you do it. Just a few more rules about lisha. There is lisha har lisha. In other words, even though something was already kneaded, it is possible to knead it again, to take it apart. Like with matzah meal. Matzah meal, when was it kneaded? When you first made the matzah. Now it's broken up into crumbs, right? The matzah meal, particles. It is still possible
to transgress this melacha of lisha by taking this matzah and preparing a real dough out of it. So you have to be careful with, because over here you do have lisha achar lisha. And we said before that lisha also applies to those which are not food items, not only food items, like mud, sand. And finally we come to a situation which is the exact opposite of lisha, but it's still asur. We talked about adding liquid to flour, or to any food item which may make a thick paste, which might be lisha. But what if something is already very liquefied? And now what you want to do is add flour to it to make it. Now you want to add flour in order to make it less liquefied, to make it more solid, right? That would also be asur, right? Just like you're taking solid and you're adding liquid to make it as a paste, to soften it. If something is already very, very soft, now you want to do the opposite. Add dry flour to it, and then mix it. It's the same thing. What you're doing right now is making a paste the other way around. That would also not be. Okay, we spoke about if you already had something mixed before Shabbat, it's less of a problem. If there was already some liquid in it, it's permissible to add liquid to it. Then we have two more items here. We have pirur ubiyot, which is, I called it in English, I translated loosening. Loosening means that even though you're not allowed to make a paste, if you take a cookie, if you take a biscuit, and you put it into tea, and it falls apart, that's permissible. That's the opposite of lisha. Lisha, you're combining, you're molding, or you're fusing. With pirur, you're breaking it up. There's no problem with breaking it up through liquid. There's a problem of breaking food items through tochen, by crushing it, or mincing it, or dicing it. But to put it into liquid where it falls apart, it does not really become paste. It's the opposite of turning into a paste. That's permissible. No, by a cookie, no. Right? Because we said that en tochen achar tochen, right? It was already ground once. Same thing with a tablet. Let's say you're giving it to a choleh, to a sick person who is allowed to take certain medication, right? Depending on how sick he is. But this particular choleh is a child. He cannot swallow the whole tablet. You're allowed to break it up. You're allowed to put it into the liquid. It will be permissible. You have to be careful not to crush it, perhaps, if possible, but to cut it up is better. And the last example is bila ava imrata. In other words, let's say you have something that you prepared for a child, some pudding that is very, very soft before Shabbat, because you would not be able to make the porridge, the pudding, and the likes on Shabbat because it's a form of lisha. But it's very, very liquid. And remember how we said that you can't, just like you cannot add liquid to solid, you cannot add a solid to liquid, so you cannot make a lisha either way you go about it. However, what you can do is that if the child refuses to eat this very liquidy food the way it is, unless you add something that's more pasty to it, what you can do is create a separate mixture or batter that is a little bit thicker with a shinui, and then mix the two together. That would be permissible. Because you cannot go ahead and take this liquid food and just begin to add to it until it becomes pasty, right? Because that's a form of lisha, regardless of which direction you go in. But to make separate batters, one which is a little bit thicker, separate, but with a shinui, of course. Right? You have to be careful, right? It has to be done with a shinui. You have to be careful not to mix it very, very much. You make it separate, and then you mix the two together. That would be permissible. And that's where you would be able to eat. For a child, this would be permissible, right? But even then, the separate mixture that you're making cannot be something which is asur min Torah. It would have to be done in a shinui way, something which is permissible. And then to mix the two would be easier, would be less of a problem than start adding the solids to the liquid to make it more of a paste than what it is right now. No, of course not. With the potato flakes or with anything which resembles that, which is called the blila ava or bar gibul especially, which is asur midoraita. It meshes quickly, fuses, and becomes a real dough. That's asur midoraita. You can't even do it with a shinui. Right? No, blila raka. For example, mixing that with those items that are only asur midirabanan, for example, that would be permissible with a shinui. Right? Anything which would be asur midoraita, that way it would not help you because you're not allowed to do it to begin with. So what good is it that you're allowed to mix later? But that which is asur midirabanan, that it would be permissible al idei shinui, it would be the best way to mix the two. Instead of adding the solid to the liquid, just make a separate batter which is already more of a blila gasa or ava a little bit, and then add it to the blila raka. Mix the two together. That would be good. Okay, I think this covers what? Which one is that? This one right here? Thin mixture? There's thick mixtures and thin mixture. The thick mixture is asur. That's the paste, right? That is commonly called lisha because it resembles water with flour. It looks like dough or pasty. That's lila ava. So anything that would resemble that thick paste would be a big problem on Shabbat. There would be almost no heter to do it. However, sometimes you don't have a very thick paste. You have something called lila raka, which involves something which is a little looser. like with matzah meal and milk, or right. It's not so pasty. It does not very much stick together. It's looser. Another good example. Well, actually, the other example was of davar nozel, mayonnaise and oil. It's not even a blila. It's completely liquid. Blila rakah, it has solid in it, but it's looser than the blila ava, which is much more like a thick paste. And the example I gave was with using even mashed avocado with oil to do a paste with the asur, to do all of that on Shabbat. And that's a little bit of a disregard before Shabbat. With a shinui, with a change. Yeah. With matzah meal is shinui, there's two ways of doing the shinui. One is by, if you ordinarily put the water into the solid, this time you do the other way around. You add the solid into the water. You do it the other way around. No, the blila rakah, you would be able to do it with a shinui, right? The second shinui would be, instead of using a regular spoon, you would use your finger, or you would use the handle of the spoon, and you would not mix it very, very thoroughly, right? You would not mix it very thoroughly. You just mix it a little bit. That's all called shinui. Let me see if I left out anything just a moment. No, the shinui means that you're allowed to do it. Unless you do it with a shinui, it would be a sur midrabanan, by rabbinic decree, because it resembles. Right? The rabbis many times prohibited something because it resembles the real thing. So even though the real thing is lila ava, right? Lila rakah would also prohibit it unless it's with a shinui. Yeah, let me just see if we left out anything else. Yeah, there could be a lot of food items that could be lila rakah. They're not very thick, they're not very pasty. They're just a lot looser. I'm sure you can think of some example. So certain cereals, children's cereals, that you buy in the can, it's not a very pasty food. It's not a very thick mixture. You might call it lila rakah. Some say that if the vegetable is already cooked, it's less of a problem. Right? Just like we had that with the hen, cooked vegetables. Right? It's already cooked, it's already softened, so you're allowed to soften it even more. You're allowed to mash it. Some say it's okay. So here too, if it's already cooked, right, and it's already soft, and you're adding a little bit of liquid to it, some say it's permissible. And remember, once something is cooked, it already has liquid. So what did we say before? Anything that already has liquid before Shabbat, you're not really contributing too much more by making it a little bit tastier, right? So that would be permissible. But to take something that had no liquid, something raw, or even if it's not raw, but it's very, very hard, and adding liquid and making a whole paste, that would be a sur. Yeah, there's other problems with the coffee that we'll talk about when we talk about bishul. Yeah, I understand, because the beans were already cooked, but they're not cooked. It goes through a different process. It's called roasting. The beans are roasted, not exactly cooked. And besides that, there are some things that are called kaleh habishul. They're not completely cooked. All